Prior Matthias finished the final, measured tilt of his head and let the embroidered stole slide from his shoulders. Elias stepped from the darkness, and the stole fell heavier than either of them expected. Doubt lodged under Elias's ribs the instant he saw the stole on the flagstones. Not because he had seen a garment drop, but because he had watched the whole performance carried out with no prayer said, and no one to hear it. He had come to the nave to confirm a rumor. He left with a clear, dangerous question. Who kept these motions and why? The nave smelled of burnt tallow and cold stone. The only sound was the scrape of Matthias's shoes when he turned and found Elias at the Eisel's edge. Elias, Prior Matthias, straightening as if he had been rehearsing the movement all evening. You should not be here at this hour. His voice was low and even. He held the stole as if it were a ledger. Elias's fingers flexed around his journal. Why perform the rite alone? Elias, why do you do the words with your lips closed? The line left no room for ceremonial euphemism. The question named the central problem. Ritual continued though conviction had gone missing. Magdalena had once told Elias that the order never abandoned its bindings, but that statement had been a citation more than an argument. It sat in his head until he saw Matthias repeat motions with the precision of a notary signing documents. Elias's first emotion was doubt. His second was alarm when he found ink smudges on the stole where someone's accounting notes had been pressed and dried. He moved closer, touched the thread, and felt grit of dust and a stain that smelled faintly of iron. Matthias did not look surprised to find Elias examining the stole. He folded the fabric and began to count ritual steps on his fingers, a motion Elias had seen before. The counting was precise and mechanical. The order performs, Matthias, and the order endures. There was no appeal to heaven, no plea to saints. It was a rule stated like a tax obligation. Elias left the nave with the stole compressed under his arm and a new urgency in his chest. He went to the archive because the archive preserved the order's bones. He found Magdalena bent over a table under a green glass lamp, sorting a stack of parchments that smelled of lamp oil. He set the stole down and spread the hymn across the table. Magdalena looked at the stole, and then at Elias's hands. You have been in the choir, she said. Her voice was thin but steady. You should have left the cloth as you found it. These things are indexed. She reached for a catalogue bead and flicked a count. The act was casual and precise. She accepted the stole without surprise. Elias, Magdalena, there are ink marks on the lining numbers. Names. They are not prayers. He flipped open the stole and pointed to a line of cramped numerals written near the seam. Magdalena did not straighten. She tilted the lamp to bring the writing into a narrow wedge of light. Bring the service book, she said. Bring the ledger. Her fingers were already moving as if she had anticipated this moment. They worked together while the archive clock clicked toward midnight. Outside the small window, wind pressed the leaded panes. Inside, Elias dictated what he saw. Marginalia, columns of tallies, names followed by sums and small crosses. Magdalena read aloud the headings in a voice trained to make abbreviations sound like commands. For the Mass on All Souls, payment received from the Hargreaves estate. For the intercession on June 3rd, the fee noted, collected by Ra, services rendered for the tomb at Westfield, recorded. The ledger was not a prayer book. It was an administrative record where rights were listed beside rents and obligations. Elias's movement tightened. He tapped the page with an ink-stained fingertip. So the rite is evidence, not devotion, he said. He had not felt rhetorical before. The words came out clipped. The ceremony is proof that the order still controls land and payments. Magdalena closed the book and placed a leather thong around it. We catalogue continuity, she said. Continuity secures rights. Without entries, rights lapse. There was no moral judgment in her tone. She treated ritual as ledger line treated property. When Elias carried the ledger into the chapter house at dawn, the chapter meeting had already begun. The stone seats held men in plain robes. Prior Matthias stood near the carved bench with his staff planted on the floor. The room smelled of stale incense and boiled wool. Elias felt his heartbeat press against his throat. He set the ledger on the central table and pushed it forward so the nearest men could read. Matthias, Elias, read this. These aren't prayers. They are records of payments and claims. He stepped back a pace so his hands would not appear to snatch. Matthias touched the cover with a thumb and made no motion to open it. Elias, he said, and the single name carried years of authority. You are young. You do not understand the order's obligations. He spoke the word obligations like a tool. Elias answered, I understand obligation. I grew up copying inventories. I know the order's claims. But I think someone is using rights to manufacture claims. They perform ceremonies for patrons who are not present and list them as served. That is fraud. His voice rose. It had a tremor. He had arrived with doubt and now felt a shift toward accusation. An older brother in the circle scoffed. Elias speaks boldly for one who has not risen in the chapter. Elias is right. Magdalena from the doorway. She had come with a bundle of papers and now took a seat without request. There are entries that do not match services rendered. The ledger cross references charters and mortmain entries. They are legal instruments, not devotional notes. She set a sealed docket on the table. Matthias opened the ledger without ceremony and scanned a line. He read aloud several entries in a clipped cadence, pausing on names and amounts. Payment marked as rendered. Westfield, 70, 2 shillings. Hargreaves Memorial Mass, 15 shillings. Manor of Lisle, perpetual commemoration recorded. He looked up and met Elias's eyes. We serve the community and we keep the books. What is your claim? Elias felt anger heat his hands. My claim is that the order performs rites to keep rights intact, not because belief demands it. The rite is a seal. It is a witness to a contract. You are using ritual as legal proof. The words landed like stones into the chapter house. 3 older men exchanged glances. One of them, Brother Simon, said, contracts without an external seal do not hold against the crown. Rituals provide the seal. That is old law. Magdalena folded her hands over the docket. We have always used forms to preserve holdings. The forms are recognized in courts. Whoever believes otherwise misunderstands the stakes. Her voice suggested that the question had been argued in ledgers before. Elias had expected to win over some men with the ledger's clarity, but the room hardened. Matthias's face did not show guilt, it showed calculation. He counted ritual steps on his fingers while the others spoke, as if confirming a procedure. Elias felt a new emotion, alarm turning to resolve. He left the chapter room with the feeling that he had shifted from observer to opponent. After that meeting, Magdalena led Elias to a back room where the archive kept its private ledger bundles. She unlocked a wooden chest and produced a small book bound in cracked leather. She opened it to a page where entries indicated rites performed for deceased patrons who were already interred years earlier. Names repeated across decades. Elias Reed. Intercession performed recorded. Benefactor Lord Arundel. Note. Claimed rent for tenement attached to commemoration. He traced the letters with a fingertip and felt grit of dried glue. They register ceremonies to sustain claims. Magdalena, they record rituals timed to legal anniversaries. They register memorials against obligations. Look at the seals on these pages. Each seal corresponds to a land grant. She tapped a stamped impression in the margin. Elias's voice fell. So the rite is a machine. It runs to produce rights. He had begun the night with doubt. Now his doubt had changed into alarm and then into a bitter clarity that made his hands shake. Magdalena folded the small book and slid it back into the chest. Do not say machine to the brothers. Say administrative ritual. They prefer that phrase. Elias who benefits. He calmed his voice on purpose. He needed a name. Magdalena's mouth thinned. The order benefits. Individuals benefit through the order. The books ensure continuity across generations. The men who run the registers keep their positions by keeping the entries consistent. Her expression did not shift into accusation. She catalogued motives as one catalogues pages. When the narrator arrived to inspect the cloister, he moved like a clinician through place and object. He measured the ritual ring cut into the stone by pacing its diameter with his boot. He pressed his palm to a carved sigil and counted the depth of its incision with a gloved thumb. He matched the ring to the ledger entries. Where Elias had felt charged feelings, the narrator mapped correlations, ledger entry date, commemorative rite performed, boundary dispute settled. He wrote terse notes into his brass, trimmed notebook and circled names. This ring marks legal execution as much as it marks liturgy. The narrator allowed to Magdalena, who had accompanied him, when you perform at the ring and record it, you create a public act that courts and neighbors accept as evidence. The ritual creates a paper trail. His voice carried no surprise, only the stance of someone who confirms an unexpected pattern and files it. Magdalena nodded. and the two of them compared the ledger to the carved ring until the narrator tapped a particular page and said, "Look here." The entry for Westfield is dated to the Feast of St. Michael, the same date carved on the ring. The record names are as present. The ring's wear matches the pattern of a staff rotated in exact sequence. This is administrative choreography. He pronounced the last phrase like a notation. Elias read over their shoulders and felt the emotion inside him twist again. He had arrived with doubt, moved through alarm and resentment, and now he felt anger that sharpened into a need to act. He wanted to expose a falsity, to remove the instrument that made claims stick. He cornered Prior Matthias in the sacristy that evening, a cluttered room of linen chests and brass candlesticks. The candles had been banked low and gave off weak pools of light. Elias approached the prior with the ledger folded under his arm and thrust it toward him. "Matthias, Elias," breath short from climbing the west stair. "You are listed as attesting to several services you could not have performed." He named the dates and the patrons. "You signed entries that preserved revenue lines. Tell me why." Elias felt his voice wobble. He forced it steady by fixing his eyes on Matthias's steel, grey ones. Matthias closed his eyes for a second and inhaled. He opened them and smiled with no warmth. "Elias," he said, "we keep the order. We are the stewards of lands and rights. If the world becomes a place where rights dissolve because someone doubts our forms, then the poor will be dispossessed and the order will vanish. I keep the form to protect what remains." His fingers found the weight of his ring. "Do you think I enjoy the motions?" "Elias, I think you use them as a ledger." He kept his sentence short. "You use ritual to preserve income. You treat prayer as proof." He leaned forward. The room smelled of beeswax and old wood. Matthias's jaw tightened. "We perform to maintain stability. You are young and you confuse moral clarity with chaos. Without the rights, disputes arise and the order's hospitals close. You would throw away a network that feeds many for the sake of your private scruples. Is that service?" Elias's anger pressed his throat. "Matthias, I am not attacking the sick or the poor. I am asking whether we pretend to serve God while accounting for rents. I am asking whether the ceremony is for God or for ledgers. If the answer is the latter, then we are frauds." Matthias's hand tightened on the staff. "Do not call it fraud in my halls," he said. Then he added, quietly, "Do not call me a fraud." The exchange became a rapid clash of lines. "You signed these entries," Elias insisted. "You counted named benefits in your hand. Why lie on the page?" He Matthias's name 3 times within a span of seconds. "Because the alternative is losing everything we have kept for centuries," Matthias returned. "Because courts respect continuous practice. Because patrons demand memorials. Because men die and claims lapse if no one registers them." Elias backed away. He felt the shift of power tighten around Matthias like a collar. The sacristy air did not change, but Elias's pulse hammered against his ribs. He realized then that he had moved from a moral argument to a confrontation where one man's calculation defended an entire structure. The confrontation broke when Elias followed Matthias down into the crypt that night. The crypt gave off a different smell. Damp earth, iron, and the faint copper tang of old blood. Torches in rusted sconces pushed orange cones across stacked sarcophagi. Elias held the ritual stole in one hand and the ledger under his arm. He had decided to prove his point by tearing the stole where it signified authority. The action would be a public rejection, a concrete motion to show that rights could be ended. Matthias moved quickly. He put a hand on Elias's wrist as Elias reached forward. The fingers were firm, not soft. He turned Elias until the torchlight carved lines across his face. "Stop, Matthias, you do this, and you break the chain. You will not break it without breaking us all." The words were a command and a plea in the same breath. Elias tried to pull free. He tugged the stole toward the sarcophagus rim and bent to tear. A splinter of wood from the lectern snapped beneath his knee. He heard a thud as Matthias's staff struck stone. The motion was sudden. Matthias was stronger than his age suggested. Elias felt his hand and the stole wrench in opposite directions. Fabric tore with a wet sound. Elias tasted metal on his lips where he had bitten them. "Elias!" Magdalena's voice came from the stair above. She had placed the ledger on the crypt step and now stood in the doorway with the narrator behind her. Her face looked smaller under lamplight. "Stop this at once. You will not make law by tearing fabric." She moved down, keeping her hands poised as if to secure a document. The narrator watched with a cold, assessing gaze. He did not intervene. He recorded the scuffle in a single notation. Stole torn, physical restraint applied, ledger placed on step. Elias broke away and stepped back, the stole hanging from his fingers in a ragged strip. Blood darkened the cuff of his sleeve where Matthias's grip had nicked him. Matthias released him with a finality that left no room for further movement. He folded the intact part of the stole and pressed it into a pouch on his belt. "You will not use violence against our forms," he said. "You will not make spectacle where law must pass as ceremony." Elias breathed fast. He pulled a hand away and set the ledger on a sarcophagus lid. He looked at Magdalena. "Magdalena, take the ledger. Record what happened." His voice had a new steadiness that carried decision rather than panic. Magdalena crossed to the step, closed the ledger, and snapped the leather thong. She tucked it into her satchel and then, with a motion practiced and sure, slid a small key from her pocket and placed it between the pages as a marker. She did not look at Elias when she did this. She looked at the ledger and at the torn stole, and decided where the order's memory would begin. The narrator lifted his notebook and read aloud a single line he had written. "Ceremony functions as legal instrument. Physical contest over stole confirms institutional claim to form." He snapped the notebook closed. "Elias," he said, "you have given us a demonstration no ledger could capture." His tone was clinical, not celebratory. Elias wrapped his hand around his bleeding thumb and felt the sting as a present, not a metaphor. He had torn the stole and been restrained. He had exposed the calculus behind the rites. He had forced a physical collision between a young scribe hungry for moral clarity and an elder who treated ritual as infrastructure. Magdalena slid the ledger into a chest and turned the key in the lock. She moved with the composure of someone who archives outcomes rather than judges them. She simply, "I will index the event and store the ledger under special seal. The entry will read, altercation, stole torn, witness, narrator, result. Ledger secured." She spoke as if reading the next line in a catalogue. Elias nodded once. He did not try to speak. He pulled his sleeve over his hand and left small red marks on the cloth. The narrator followed him past the stacked coffins. The torchlight threw the two of them into long, thin shadows on the corridor wall. Outside, in the cloister, the ritual ring lay where the narrator had measured it earlier. Moonlight had thinned to a cold silver. Elias stepped over the carved circle without placing his staff. He did not perform the rotation. He could not. He had chosen a side. He would either copy marginalia until the last entry, or he would refuse to supply the signatures that made the pages binding. He had not decided which. Magdalena closed the ledger in the locked chest and counted the entries aloud under her breath as a practice. The motion steadied her. The narrator set his brass, trimmed notebook back into his satchel and checked the depth of ink on a sample page. Prior Matthias returned to his duty, pressing the folded stole to his chest and expelling a breath as if the air itself were a document he could fold. Elias walked away from the cloister with the torn strip of stole still clinging to his jacket. He reached the archway that led to the town and paused. He felt exhaustion and a new calculation in his bones. He had started the night with doubt, moved through alarm, anger, and into a collision that forced the ledger to be sealed as evidence. He had made a concrete choice. The evidence existed now in the archive, authenticated by Magdalena's hands and the narrator's notation. When he stepped into the street, the first cart clattered past and a baker called out an order. The world continued with mundane sounds. Elias tucked his bleeding hand into his sleeve and kept walking, the stolen cloth dangling like a ragged margin of a book. Magdalena's last recorded phrase echoed. The ledger secured. The final, concrete act of the chapter was not a pronouncement but a motion. Magdalena turned the key and set the leather book into darkness. Silence followed in the archive, but the ledger's weight would press against the order's future for years to come. Elias crouched behind a carved bench and watched Prior Matthias press his seal into fresh wax and slide the quill back into its cradle. Doubt cut across Elias's throat the instant the iron ring left the parchment. He tightened his fingers around the copied folio until the edges creased. The council chamber smelled of damp wood and heated metal. A town magistrate tapped the table twice and said, "We are agreed." Elias knew in that moment what the agreement would cost. Ritual authority traded for trade rights, prayer for privileges. The suspicion, cold, precise, moved him to stand, to act, before the council could disperse. He had not meant to be seen, he had meant only to learn. Elias had slipped in through a narrow side door while lanterns swung above the chapter house and the chapter table clustered around Prior Matthias. He had learned the order's noon prayers, the cadence of incense, where the choir kept the extra vellum. He knew the exact time the prior would lower his voice and sign where the magistrate pointed. The first 5 lines of the charter were technical. Toll exemptions, brigade authority, town grain allotments. The 6th line had been written in a different hand. It granted the order the right to nominate 2 civic officers. Elias's hand closed over his folio as if he could keep the clause from leaving the room. He pushed past the bench, caught the hem of a robe, and moved forward with a purpose that surprised his own body. "Prior Matthias," he said, his voice low but steady in the hush. Heads turned. The magistrate's eyes flicked to the door where the candles guttered. The prior folded the charter, ink still wet, and his face did not change. Elias felt his pulse shift from doubt to urgency. "Elias." Prior Matthias's voice came, clipped without warmth. The prior's hand rested on the ring at his throat. "What do you think you are doing here?" Elias held up the copy. "This is the charter you signed. It ties our rights to civic rights. The town will treat our prayers as transactions." He let the words fall into the chamber. He saw immediate movement. The magistrate's jaw tightened. A merchant to Elias's left cursed under his breath. The prior's posture stayed formal. "Sit, Elias. Speak after the council." No, Elias kept his feet planted. People should know. The liturgy just validated a payment. That isn't prayer. It's a bargain. He looked at the magistrate. "Will you answer, Magistrate Corbin?" Corbin showed annoyance and the practiced smile of a man used to agreements. "Mitter. Scribe, this meeting concerns trade and civic order. It is not your place to interrupt." He faced the prior. It was witnessed. "The order keeps its privileges. The town keeps its roads. All is well." The chamber hummed with power. Elias felt his doubt thicken into something harder. Doubt had driven him here. Now doubt demanded proof. He took a step toward the table and almost knocked over a candlestick. Later, Elias would recall how silence held the room like iron. He did not notice the silence then. He noticed only the quill line where the prior's hand had paused. He noticed the way the magnet of the prior's authority moved merchants and magistrates, the way a bell moved parishioners. He noticed, most of all, that ritual had become the mechanism of barter. After the council, Elias went directly to the cloister. Night had fallen so completely that the stone gutters held black pools. He kept the folio folded beneath his cloak and forced his feet to pace as he approached Magdalena's doorway. The archivist's small window was a square of lamplight. A stack of bound registers cast low shadows across a table. He knocked 3 times. Magdalena opened with a cautious glance. "Elias, it is late." Her voice was careful. Her hands wiped at a strip of vellum. "Magdalena, look." He pushed the copy across her table. The order signed away nomination rights. They used a blessing as witness. Why are the rights binding townsmen's obligations? Magdalena's eyes moved over the charter, narrowing. She touched the amended clause with a fingertip and said, "They have been careful. See here, amendments in the margins, seals from 2 merchants, a docket from Corbin." This is not the first time. She led him through the cloister to the undercroft. The small door to the archives was iron, bound, and had a tumbler that smelled faintly of oil and old glue. Magdalena's fingers found the hidden latch beneath a shelf. A panel slid back to reveal a thin stair and the smell of dust. It was there, under low lamplight, that she pulled a registry with a string of indexing beads and opened a page that had been rubbed dark at the edges. "We keep minutes here that do not appear in the chapter book." Magdalena, look, her finger traced a sequence of entries. A guildman paying for the ringers to toll on harvest day. A line noting a donation in exchange for a named commemoration. A notation in the margin that a specific prayer would be said on account of a loan. The ink had been amended over time. They map favors to feast days. "The rituals are the receipt." She tapped the page. "The order's continuity runs on these entries." Elias read until his eyes burned. Each entry narrowed the space between ritual and exchange until the space vanished. He felt anger, sharp in his throat. The anger pushed him to speak more plainly than he meant. "Magdalena, have you indexed every payment like this?" She answered without surprise, "Not every one." only those linked to privileges. Some names repeat, others are local brokers. The prior negotiates in prayers because prayers confer legitimacy. Without that public performance, the people would not accept the offices we sell. Elias's heart picked up rhythm. Suspicion had become clarity. Clarity moved him toward a plan. We should show this at the next liturgy. We should show everyone the ledger and the charter. The people should know their rights were sold. Magdalena's hands paused over the registry. She closed her eyes for a breath and then opened them narrow and controlled. Elias, you know what that will do. The prior will call this spectacle treasonous. The chapter will claim you sought to disrupt the order. I have seen how the chapter treats disturbance. He looked at her. You keep these records. You can prove it. If you will not reveal them, who will? Magdalena's jaw set. She pushed a small silver bookmark with a tiny key across the page. I preserve. I do not, as a rule, wreck continuity. The rules keep people safe, they argued then, two voices in a narrow room. Elias's lines came quick and sharp. Magdalena, this is not safety. This is calculation. Elias, this is how the order survives. If the town withdraws privileges, the brothers starve, then let the town vote honestly. Elias snapped. Don't let sacraments stand in for ledger entries. Magdalena's reply was softer. You think the brothers will bluster and fall. You do not know what the chapter would do to public dissent. Their exchange ended with 3 clipped lines as they each counted consequences, then silence. The argument had shown a split in priorities, Elias's desire to expose and Magdalena's insistence that preservation required subtlety. Before dawn, Elias found himself summoned to Prior Matthias's study. He walked under a slate sky, clutching his small leather-bound journal. The prior's study smelled of old wax, and the metallic tang the memory brief had noted. The ring on the prior's hand caught the weak light. The prior sat behind a heavy desk, the charter folded between them. You should not have interrupted the council, Matthias. His voice was quiet, precise, that action endangered the order's standing and the town's arrangements. You must understand context. Elias felt fear rise, thin and immediate, when the prior's hand lifted and tapped the ledger. The fear stayed as a physical hollow. You sold nominations. Elias, you used the liturgy as witness to a contract. That is not the order's work. Matthias's eyes did not waver. We were offered stability. The town was offered services. Both sides bargained. I sealed what they needed. You show up after brandishing a copy. That is a childish rebellion, Elias. Is it childlike to tell people the truth? The prior's mouth thinned. He leaned forward and counted the points on his fingers, as if listing steps. Elias, listen, the order is older than the town council. The order's ceremonies construct authority in this region. If authority collapses, chaos follows. The men who fund us expect continuity. They will withdraw support if the spectacle becomes unreliable. There are hungry brothers to feed. There are tombs to maintain. There are contracts already signed. If you force a rupture, you will not restore belief. You will restore ruin. Elias's chest tightened. Anger pushed against that fear. He felt it in his hands. They are not prayers anymore, prior. They are receipts. Matthias closed the ledger and slid it toward Elias. You can challenge the chapter. You can attempt exposure. The chapter will respond. It will be harsh. It will be efficient. That is all. He did not threaten in words, but his calm implied lines that had weight. Elias swallowed and left the study with a stomach that felt like a fist. Doubt that had opened as suspicion shifted into a new register. Fear of consequence tempered by determination. Back in the archives, Magdalena produced another object. A thin ledger she kept hidden in an alcove behind a false spine. She opened it and revealed rows of entries that matched the charter's dates. Many entries bore marginal notes in Magdalena's own hand, sometimes a single word. Recorded, allocated, sealed, she had been the quiet clerk of continuity for years, not out of zeal, but because records were currency. You cannot show this, she said. If you expose every bargain, you unmake the order's ability to operate. The town will take what it can. The brothers will be left without means. Elias's reply was blunt. Is that your choice? To keep the machinery running. She looked at him without flinching. I preserve our instruments. I preserve our identity. If identity requires compromise, I catalogue it. That is my work. He stared at her for a long second and then reached into his cloak and extracted the copies he had made. He slid one back across the table and said, Then you must choose. Will you present these at the liturgy or will you erase them? Magdalena's fingers hovered over the copy. She touched it and then withdrew her hand. Elias, the chapter will convene after the disruption. They will decide. I will prepare the minutes as required. Elias felt betrayed and vindicated at once. He had hoped her loyalty would align with his outrage. Instead, she offered a third route, preservation by omission. His anger sharpened into resolve. He would act. The plan took shape in the scriptorium before sunrise. Elias copied the charter into several folios, numbering each, adding marginalia to guide readers to the ledger entries. He wrote a brief note to the townsfolk, plain and unadorned, stating what he had seen. He stuffed the folios into a narrow vent that led behind the nave, where drafts could carry the papers into the public aisles on a windy day. He believed the liturgy would be full. He wanted the interruption to be public. At the liturgy, the church was close with bodies. Voices rose on the prayer. Elias waited until the cantor reached the confession. Then he stood. Prior Matthias, he called, his voice carrying, I present evidence that the order has traded rights for favors. I present a charter and ledger to show how our ceremonies have been sold. Heads turned. Candles flickered. The prior's face did not betray surprise. He did not seem to need to breathe. He rose, steadied the embroidered stole across his shoulders, and spoke. This is a dangerous accusation. Matthias, present it now, and you make the act itself your judgment. He gestured subtly. Two brothers at the choir steps moved forward, their grip sure and practiced. We will adjudicate. Elias held the folio out. Magdalena can verify the entries. The public should decide. Behind the choir, Magistrate Corbin rose as if called. This is a public disturbance. We shall hear it in the chapter, not in a church. The order protects sacred order by condemning spectacle. He sat and motioned to guards. Before Elias could respond, hands closed on his shoulders. He felt a strip of leather looped around his wrists and a breath of incense. People murmured. Someone, he cries treason. Another, he seeks to shame the prior. Matthias spoke to the gathered people in a voice that measured each phrase. Elias has interrupted a liturgy with unvetted documents. He will be bound and brought before the chapter. The chapter will hear evidence and pass sentence. This is the proper path. Elias tried to speak, but the guard's grip tightened, and the world narrowed to the scrape of sandal leather and the iron of a cuff. He was led from the nave under the same lanterns that had hung when he had first crept into the council. Fear surged again, raw and immediate, but the fear contained the seed of something else, a stubborn refusal to let the matter end with him silenced. After the liturgy, the chapter convened. Prior Matthias framed Elias's act as a public spectacle meant to destabilize order. He spoke with the same clipped cadences he had used in the study, then proposed censure, binding Elias for a season and removing his scribe duties. Elias listened as his fate was spoken like a ledger entry. Magdalena sat to one side, her face unreadable, and later, when the chapter voted, she drew the minutes near and altered a passage that might have implicated specific merchants. Her pen slid with the quiet economy of someone sealing a provision. That small motion, her pen crossing out a merchant's name and replacing it with a neutral phrase, was the twist Elias had not expected. He had assumed exposure required only courage. He had not counted on the archival choices that could erase a fact from official record. He felt that revelation like a sudden chill. The order could not only bargain in rituals but also edit history. Elias was bound and led to a small cell beneath the chapter hall. He had a narrow pallet and a sliver of window. He had been censured from the choir and had his duties reassigned to copying ledgers. Magdalena came twice to the cell. Each time she left him a cup of watered wine and a single line of inked marginalia indicating new entries she had cross-referenced. She never said whether she had left the damaging folios where he had hidden them. In the scriptorium that night, emptied of men and lamp, wick, Elias worked with hands that trembled. He traced the registry entries he had memorized and compared them to the amended minutes. He found the same pattern repeating. Favors recorded as commemorations, payments annotated as alms, a consistent method of transforming cash into rights. He pushed back against exhaustion and fear with method. He copied selected entries onto fresh vellum and smuggled them into the vent where he had hidden the folios earlier. When he finished, his hands bled faintly from the quill. He whispered the names of those he had catalogued. Corbin, the merchant hand, Master Reed. Saying the names was an attempt to fix them against Erasha. He closed the vent and pressed a finger to the seam. In the dim rooftop light he felt not catharsis, but a narrow, resolute fatigue. Magdalena visited once more before dawn. She placed her palm on the table and said plainly, "I altered minutes today. I removed one name. I did it to shield a family who would have been ruined. I recorded other entries in a ledger I keep apart. You will find it, Elias, if you search the alcove behind the false spine. But I will not present everything in public. I cannot unmake the order in one night." Elias looked at her. "So you will produce the ledger in pieces?" He asked. "I will protect the living and preserve the instruments for future repair," she answered. "You will decide what you do with what you have hidden." He left the scriptorium with a set of fresh copies tucked under his tunic. The chapter had censured him. The prior had shown how a ritual could pivot into a trial. Magdalena had proven that paper and pen could erase witness as effectively as binding hands. The emotional motion in Elias shifted twice in the span of a day. Doubt to anger to fear to a stubborn resolve carried by precise action. Those shifts had not been described for sensation alone. They had moved him into choices. Late that night he climbed to the attic where the vent ended near an empty choir stall. He shoved the remaining copies into the narrow opening and pushed each sheet until it caught in the duct. He pressed his palm flat to the wood and listened. In the corridor below someone paced. Steps approached. He heard a key turn in a lock. Elias held his breath and felt the weight of the day's events fold into a single present. He had exposed the mechanism he had been censured, and he had made a decision to hide proof where the public might find it. Outside, the cloister bells struck the hour. Inside, his hands were steady enough to tuck the last folio in place. The door began to open. Elias moved with a held breath and a scraping stool under his hand when he saw Magdalena lift the ledger. Suspicion tightened his jaw as he watched her work the brass catch and ease the book free. He counted the sound of leather on wood like a second clock. The archive smelled of oil and dust. The cabinet's lock had given a small metallic click that made Elias freeze. He stepped from the shadow of a shelf and spoke before he could measure consequence. "Magdalena, Elias, what are you doing with that ledger?" Magdalena's hand paused under her robes. She did not startle. She slid the folio higher and kept her voice low. "Elias, close the curtain." Now her fingers left a faint smear of ink on the book's spine when she tightened her hold. Elias obeyed. He pulled the heavy linen curtain closed and felt the linen scratch his knuckles. His mouth filled with a dry taste. His palms left marks on the curtain's hem. The suspicion that had lodged in his ribs in recent nights shifted into a new, sharper motion. He wanted proof, not rumor. He stepped forward and took the ledger from her, palm to palm. Magdalena did not snatch it back. She looked at him over the ledger's edge, and the light of the lamplight caught the edge of her eyeglasses. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "A ledger, Elias. You are stealing an order book." His voice had a tremor he tried to hide. She closed the book and tapped a finger on the margin. "Not stealing." Protecting, her thumb found a page edge and flattened it with a practiced motion. "You have seen the council records, Elias. You have copied seals. You know the difference between ritual and record." Her tone narrowed, not pleading but fast and efficient. Elias's hands tightened on the binding. His doubt shifted into indignation. He remembered the seal Prior Matthias had pressed into wax 2 nights ago. The iron ring had left a precise crescent, and Elias had watched the quill slide back into its cradle. That image, the prior's hand, the wax, sat next to the memory of the stole falling in the nave. He had been there when the embroidered stole slid and hit the flagstones. Those concrete events pushed him toward action. This order keeps what it wants hidden. Elias, where did you take it? Magdalena's jaw worked. She reached into a hidden pocket and drew out a small silver key on a cord. She did not meet his eyes when she held it out. "To the ring in the cloister where the folios sleep," she said. "Come. If you will judge, judge with facts." Her voice was small, precise. There was no softness. They left through a narrow service passage. The undercroft steps gritted beneath their soles. Damp came up from the stones. Elias felt a second emotion move through him, unease different from suspicion and indignation. A raw, physical alertness that tightened his throat and pushed him forward. He moved faster than Magdalena expected, and almost collided with her in the stairwell. An external knock sounded above as they pushed into the cloister. Crows had left a smear on the sill. The great stone ring in the middle of the floor looked like a shallow well when the morning light touched its carved edges. Magdalena held the ledger with both hands and set it on a low table. She found the folio they wanted beneath a loose paving stone and laid it beside the ledger like a second patient on a ward. They opened the ledger at a lamplit table. Elias watched inked lines run across the pages. Dates, village names, lists of duties, tithers, and between those entries ritual instructions written not as prayers but as procedures. A name. 5th of Lent, a place. Steordian. Beside each ritual entry, there were faint legal notations, fees, obligations, penalties. The handwriting was small and clipped, not impassioned. Elias read the words aloud in short bursts. Listen, Elias, it lists ceremonies and then bonds them to land and labor. He tapped the margin where a clerk had written a legal formula. Magdalena did not smile. We operate as agent and registry, she said. The order took custody of rights and, in time, used them to bind obligation. The folio traces that transformation. She flipped a page and pointed to a faded seal. A low wind moved through the cloister and tossed a loose scrap of vellum onto the table. The sound of falling paper made Elias look up. He found a second emotion shifting beneath his indignation and alertness. Alarm. He touched the page as if the ink might sting. So it's not piety that keeps these ceremonies alive, Elias muttered. It's paperwork. His eyes narrowed like a man recalculating a debt. Power survives when belief does not, Magdalena. She spoke it as a fact, not a lament. She reached in a pocket and produced a list of towns dated decades back. Look here, she slid the paper under Elias's hand. An event shifted the scene. Footsteps in the passageway, slow and deliberate. Elias looked to the exit and saw Prior Matthias's silhouette in the doorway, framed by the first pale light of pre-dawn. He stood with his staff. The prior carried a ring on his finger that caught the dawn like a small coin of iron. Prior Magdalena, and she did not stand or bow. She draped the ledger and folio protectively with her shawl. Elias felt his heartbeat spike. The suspicion that had opened the chapter became an accusation in his mouth. Prior Matthias set his staff against the table and rested both palms on the wood. Magdalena, Elias, he said, you make my sleeping hours a crowd. His voice was low, gravelly, with a clipped cadence. Elias stepped forward. Prior Matthias, these pages show your rights signed to lands and obligations. You use ritual as legal instrument. Why hide it? He spoke quickly, words clipped by fear, by the need to get the accusation sharp in the room. Prior Matthias let his gaze move across the ledger without hurry. Because I would not have you burn what shelter gives to the hungry, he replied. Because some names endanger the poor if revealed. What would you have us do? Tear up obligations that feed villages? His hands found the embroidered stole at his belt and smoothed it, as if its texture steadied him. Elias felt anger rise, and then a colder calculation. You preserve form and profit, he said. You hide debts in ritual language. He watched the prior's features. The set of his jaw, the small healed burn on his cheek that showed when he turned his face toward the lamplight. The prior did not move to strike Elias. Instead, he leaned forward and placed a hand on the ledger. We use what remains to keep people housed, Elias. We could shred these pages and lose that structure. Or we could redact what harms them and continue the work. Which will you choose? His question had the mechanical precision of a judge's weighing scale. A rapid exchange followed, 3 short lines that snapped like a cord. Redact. Elias, you would hide names and keep the obligations. Yes, Prior Matthias, redact names that endanger. Keep the mechanisms that feed. That is not justice, Elias. That is secrecy masked as mercy. Magdalena folded her hands and spoke for the first time in a thread of rapid, practical sentences. Elias, listen. We have once saved a village from starvation by diverting a tithe. We have once used a ceremonial visitation to reassign harvest to the widows. I have the receipts. I have entries. If you burn the ledger, you will also burn records that claim resources in their favor. Her voice was low and precise. Every word had the weight of a ledger entry. Elias's indignation faltered. The first emotion, suspicion, had moved into indignation and then into alarm. Now he felt a new pivot, unwillingness to cause immediate harm. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then produced a plan. Show me a single entry where a redaction protected the poor, and not the privileged, he demanded. Show me names redacted and outcomes logged. He turned the ledger so the prior could see his demand in ink. Prior Matthias removed a slip of parchment from his robe and placed it on the table. "There," he said, "entry Fust, Ordian, 3rd year. The redaction is noted and the redistribution recorded. The widow receives 3 bushels. The steward is reassigned. We kept the form and preserved the harvest." He tapped the page with a finger that had counted rights for decades. Elias read the lines. The paper described commodities, not prayers. It listed exactly how many bushels and who received them. The factual clarity grounded Elias's anger in arithmetic. He could feel another emotion aligning under the surface, reluctant respect for the mechanics that did good, but it collided with a second shock. He folded the folio and murmured, "Why are the legal notations written in ritual script?" Magdalena answered quickly, "Because ceremony intimidates and compels. A man will follow a ritual step even when he doubts its meaning. An order wrote obligation into that step, and the populace obeyed out of habit. That habit enforced law. That is how rights become binding paper." She pushed the ledger back toward Elias like a scalpel. Elias felt the scenario tighten. He reached to take the folio, and then tried to lift it completely. At that moment, the prior's 2 attendants, who had been in the passage, stepped forward and moved to block him. The room shrank to bodies and breath. Elias felt a physical push on his forearm as one attendant barred his wrist. The attempted theft, his attempt to remove the folio, became a physical struggle. He pulled. Hands closed on the pages. The folio slid across the table. Magdalena lunged and caught Elias's wrist. Prior Matthias's voice rose into a clipped command. "Enough." The struggle halted like a door snapped shut. Elias panted. He met Magdalena's eyes and saw a fast flicker that ran across her face. Calculation, then concession. She stepped between Elias and the prior and negotiated with a string of short sentences. "Redact the names we fear will be killed if named, Magdalena. Redact specific lines that would expose our informants. In return, we will add protections for the poor in the folio itself. We will register relief in the ledger under formal obligation. We will allow Elias to inspect the redactions for accuracy and to propose additions for oversight." Her last phrase sounded like a bargain sealed in a courtroom. There were 3 rapid lines exchanged after that. "You would keep power, Elias. You would keep the structure." "Yes," Prior Matthias replied. "And we will bind it to redistribution. And I watch the edits. Elias, I will watch the edits or I will leave." Elias felt the next emotion settle in. A wary acceptance mixed with bitterness. He agreed to stay and to help inspect the redactions, not because he trusted the prior, but because the ledger's entries showed real people on its pages who would starve if they lost the order's structure. The choice was practical and ugly. Magdalena produced a small quill and a red wax stick. She handed the quill to Elias. "You will initial the redactions you approve," she said. "You will write the names you insist remain. Then we will seal the folio back into the ring." Her movement was brisk. Elias bent over the pages. He read names aloud in short, clipped tones, and then whispered the words he would allow to stand. Each time he initialed a redaction, his hand trembled slightly. He felt shame that he had to mark out names at all. He felt, too, a shift, from suspicion to indignation to alarm to reluctant complicity. 3 days later, Elias walked the cloister with an edited folio under his arm. He had signed the small, careful initials beside each redaction. His handwriting left ink stains on his fingertips. He had watched Magdalena replace a sealed folio into the carved stone ring, and he had watched Prior Matthias count ritual steps on his fingers in a way Elias knew now was habit, not faith. The order resumed its outward calm. The prior smoothed his robes and spoke to attendants in the same clipped cadence. The institutional machinery turned on. The aftermath left Elias with a new, quieter emotion, fracture. He found that the stolen urgency he had carried to expose the ledger had become a slow, stubborn ache behind his ribs. He had not forced wholesale change. He had not destroyed the bind between ritual and obligation. He had negotiated, and in negotiation the ledger remained more intact than he wanted. An unexpected twist surfaced. A margin note Elias had not noticed earlier, scrawled in a different hand. It recorded a small payment decades earlier to a named abbess who had once argued for transparency and been exiled. The note showed the prior had once silenced internal dissent with exile, not persuasion. Elias read it and felt betrayal fuse with clarity. He had evidence that the order protected itself by removing voices that asked for reform. He confronted Magdalena with the note. "Magdalena, this shows you removed opposition once. Why should I trust you now, Elias?" Magdalena's hands folded in her lap. "Because exile cost us knowledge and a voice that cared for the small farms," she said. "Because I learned from that mistake. Because I now choose continuity that prevents starvation rather than purity that kills it. I will not lie. I will not revive exile if you watch me." Her voice was thin, near whisper, but steady and certain. They argued with short lines again, 5 quick exchanges that sharpened like knives. "You kept the ledger hidden. We kept people fed. You hid names that deserved exposure. We redacted names that would lead to murder. Then why exile her?" "Because she risked the whole rural food chain with her recklessness." Elias did not have a clean answer. The argument left him with no triumphant certainty. He had pushed for truth and received and negotiated partial truth. The book remained where it had always been, the ring remained in the stone, and the orders outward continuity endured. In the final scene, Elias left at dawn with the edited folio's photocopy stitched into his small leather journal. He closed the cloister gate behind him and heard Prior Matthias call a single line across the yard. "Keep the ledger where it serves." Elias could hear the servants move. He walked away with ink on his fingers and a throat raw from speaking. He felt resignation shaped like a practical decision. Choose exposure and ruin a village, or choose secrecy and preserve lives. The decision weighed on him like a heavy book under the arm. The chapter resolved its immediate conflict. The attempted theft, the confrontation, and the bargain all reached a consequence. Magdalena returned the folio to the stone ring at dawn, locking it behind the same silver key. Elias left the order that morning, not banished, but not at peace. Prior Matthias resumed counting ritual steps to steady himself. The ledger remained part shield and part engine. Elias put his hand to the small sheet that recorded the exiled abbess and folded it into his journal, a concrete decision stored for another day. The narrator later recorded the incident as evidence that rituals had become administrative tools. He noted how the ledger translated gestures into laws. The chapter ends with Elias stepping onto the cold path beyond the cloister, his ink, stained fingers tracing the outline of a name he would not forget, and the ring of the vault silent behind him. Magdalena shoved the slab with both hands and cold grit scraped her palms. The stone shifted and a ring of carved stone lay bare under moonlight. Prior Matthias was already kneeling at the center of the cloister, his hands arranging the embroidered stole over the ring as if placing a patient into a bed. Elias burst through the cloister arch, breath sharp, voice loud enough to throw the lantern light. "Why perform this now?" he demanded. Suspicion sat in Elias's chest like a pressed coin. He could not dismiss the timing or the secrecy. Magdalena did not step back. She crouched, fingers tracing the carved sigil that had been hidden under moss. The glyph's indentations still held grime and damp. The circle survived the roof. It's intact, the line landed like a splinter between the 3 of them. Prior Matthias straightened slowly and smoothed the stole with 2 precise motions. His face did not show belief, it showed habit. Elias paced a single short step closer, jaw tight. "Matthias, this is theta. You run the liturgy to keep the rents and the tenantry. You know that." He named the charge plainly. His voice shook. Anger followed suspicion in the same breath. Prior Matthias's hand moved to the heavy ring on his finger. "Elias, speak with sense. The order's obligations are written. We keep the rights and the lands remain ours." His cadence clipped, almost ceremonial in itself. Magdalena folded the moss into the hollow and rose, holding the torch lower so the carved ring caught the flame. "No," she said. "Read the ledger first." She had the ledger under her robe, its leather swollen with damp. Her tone carried a second motion. Calculation. The group had arrived at a collision between motive and material. The central problem now stood in the open. Were they maintaining ritual to honor whatever belief had been left, or to protect the order's legal and economic privileges? Elias answered with a short laugh that tasted of disbelief. "We perform for privilege, not God. We pretend." His hands made the motion of casting something away. Doubt hardened into accusation. Prior Matthias's knuckles whitened around the staff. "We perform to hold the community together," he countered. His voice named duty rather than faith. Magdalena stepped between them and set the ledger on a flat slab. She opened the ledger with deliberate care. Pages sighed. The seals were tight but not unreadable. She thumbed to a half, hidden folio and set a candle so that wax pooled at the margin. The candlelight revealed columns of entries, names, dates, small payments, and a narrow column of legal citations. Magdalena read aloud with the thin, precise voice that had catalogued every entry for decades. Article 22, she said. A named right performed annually secures exemption from tithers on 3 holdings and grants the order 1 market right in each township. Performance is required in perpetuity by this charter. Her voice stopped. The room rearranged itself around that fact. Silence followed for a single breath. Elias's hands went to his pockets and found the ink-stained nibs there. His second emotion shift began. From suspicion to a rising, furious clarity. So you keep kneeling so tenants don't lose fields, he said. You keep singing because a clause demands it. He spit the last words. Prior Matthias lifted the stole and let it fall to the stones like a curtain. And if we cease, we lose everything we hold for the order, he said. You would strip our brothers of their homes. You would let children be turned out. His claim was concrete. It was an immediate consequence. Elias stepped forward and touched the carved ring as if testing whether the stone would confirm betrayal, then bring it to the chapter. He said, let the body decide. Stop hiding behind ritual and ledger. He forced a decision into the air. Magdalena closed the ledger partly and tucked its corner under her arm. We will not decide here by shouting, she said. We call the chapter. We present the clause and let them see the ledger. Her manner restrained the fight mechanically, as if containment were a necessary ritual of its own. They moved at once. Scene changed. Torchlight the slow lock of the chapter house. The council chairs scraped into place. Prior Matthias walked with the staff, straight-backed. Elias shuffled with the stool he used for copying, hands still trembling. Magdalena carried the ledger like an accusation and an altar combined. The narrator watched from the doorway, pen poised, recording without comment. The next external event arrived. The chamber door shut and the council assembled with reluctant steps. At the council table, cold wax on the ledger caught new light. Councillors arrived tight-lipped. The narrator set the context in short, factual notes. The order had lost most outward conviction after the Reformation. Many brothers performed rites as inherited motion. The present dispute would test whether the motion could continue as purely institutional apparatus. Prior Matthias addressed the room first. Brothers, he said, we face a choice. The charter binds us. Cease the rite and we forfeit lands and market rights. His tone appealed to caution. Elias responded directly. We cannot keep pretending, he said, and his sentences came clipped and fast. Pretending makes us brittle. Pretending hands power to those who count seals and holdings without reason. We are paying tenancy with ritual. It is dishonest and dangerous. Magdalena turned a page and flicked her finger against a sealing wax smear. Article 22 exists, she said plainly. The ledger names payments attached to performance. The charter was written in ink and witnessed with seal and signature. We can read the financial consequences in the margins. The room's attention split into procedural steps and moral outrage. A brisk exchange followed that met the requirement for rapid back. And fourth, Matthias, Elias, you've kept the forms because you benefit. Elias, Matthias answered. I keep the forms because the house survives when duty is precise. Magdalena, Elias snapped. Why hide this? It was not hidden from the chapter, she replied. It was kept from agitation. I kept it to prevent panic in the old years. You kept it to prevent questions. Elias shot back. Words do not absolve hiding. The terse dialogue shaped who each was. Matthias formal, Elias impatient and direct, Magdalena measured and quietly culpable. The council voted to inspect the full sealed charter. The sealed document required a steward's key, which Magdalena produced from a hidden pocket. She placed the key on the table and pushed it toward the head of the council. Open it, she said. Let the facts stand without rumor. The head of the council, Brother Luth, tapped the wax and counted signatures. He read aloud a clause that had not been spoken outside the archive in years. The annual named rights performance preserved the order's tax standing for 3 holdings and guaranteed a market right, but failure triggered inspection and potential forfeiture. This revelation was the plot twist. Ritual was not merely custom but legally operative. The consequence changed the argument from moral purity to institutional survival. Elias's shoulders dropped an inch as if a rope had looped about his sternum. He had expected hypocrisy. He had not expected statute. You mean we've been kneeling to keep roofs over people's heads? Prior Matthias did not soften. I mean we kept the roofs because a hand can hold a seal better than a prayer now. Magdalena tapped the ledger and announced a second detail. The charter included contingency clauses. A scheduled performance could be substituted by documented proof that the rite had been performed prior or by a legal instrument of transfer. The council could preserve holdings by accounting maneuvers at cost. The mood shifted again. That was the second required emotion shift. From anger into bargaining and calculation, men who had spoken in absolutes already began to count costs. Brother Luth looked at Elias. If we stop, we risk the fields. If we persist, we keep obligations that empty our words. He spoke like a clerk. Elias's reply was a small, bitter laugh. So the order trades bread for ritual. Where is the soul in that trade? Matthias put his palm on the ledger. The soul is a luxury when men are hungry, Elias. We hold survival as our first obligation. The room smelled faintly of sweat and melted candle wax. Arguments fragmented into negotiation. Who would accept reform? Who would demand continuity? Who would press for a legal workaround? Magdalena suggested a compromise that was concrete and surgical. Petition the overlords for a reclassification of the rite as a civil obligation rather than a liturgical one. Convert the named rite into a documented ceremony performed by the chapter in writing alone. We can strip the ceremony of its priestly gloss and keep the legal mechanism. She said, we can perform an administrative act in the hall instead of a chant at the ring. She explained the steps. Sign affidavits, notarize the record, present witnesses. Her solution appealed to calculation rather than faith. Elias's reaction was immediate and physical. He slammed his palm on the table and stood. That is still pretending, he said. It keeps the forms and loses the break. He moved toward the cloakroom. If you want to keep the lands, do it, but not by pretending to worship what we do not feel. His chest heaved. The second large external event arrived when he took the stole that Matthias had left on a peg and walked toward the cloister with it. Prior Matthias leapt up and blocked him. A physical scuffle began at the arch. Fingers curled into fabric. Elias tried to wrench the stole away. Prior Matthias braced his staff and dug his heels. Magdalena stepped between them and pushed the ledger down on the bench as a temporary shield. The narrator noted the motions with short, clinical sentences. Elias tugged, Matthias gripped, the stole stretched. Brother Loth interceded with a clerical calm, telling them to stop, but the confrontation had already become kinetic. This was the final escalation before the planned climax. They returned to the cloister ring under a narrower sky. The moon had not moved. The light pooled unchanged. Elias held the stole like an accusation. I will break the ring, he said. If it is the law you serve, then break the thing that binds us to that law. Prior Matthias answered, breath quick, voice low. You will break what keeps roofs above our heads. Magdalena set the ledger on the stone and touched the carved glyph with an index finger. The ledger lay between them as proof, weapon and ledger both. Elias moved first. He raised his foot and struck the carved ring with the haft of a stool. The stone jarred, hairline cracks spidered from the point of contact. Prior Matthias dove forward and caught Elias's wrist. They wrestled. Elias kicked again and the stool fractured. The final required climax scene unfolded exactly as the outline bade. A physical and moral struggle centered on the ring and stole. Magdalena acted with a decision that resolved her arc. She stepped to the edge of the ring, placed her palm flat on the carved sigil, and said, "Stop." Her voice carried no high emotion. It carried the ledger's authority. She looked at Elias and then at Matthias. You both think you protect the order, she said. But the ledger binds more than land. It binds trust. You will both have to sign new entries for any change. We cannot unmake what is written without witnesses and a record. She produced a small sealed folio she had kept hidden. Contingency forms, pages signed by previous archivists transferring temporary rights in cases of rupture. Elias released his grip first. He looked at the folio and then at the cracked stone. The third emotion shift happened. Rage flickered into exhaustion and then into a bitter, resolved action. He drew a short knife from his belt, not to injure, but to strike the stole free. He cut the stole's sewn hem, where the embroidered sigil stitched through. The fabric fell like an answer. Prior Matthias caught the remaining fold and wept once, a dry sound without tears. You cut a thing we swore by, he said. You have cut more than cloth. Ilias tucked the torn hymn into his coat. The ring remained partially broken. The stone bore a fresh gouge. The council rallied. Some reached for keys and emergency charters. Others moved to take inventory of holdings that might be at risk. Men argued about immediate measures, send envoys, petition for temporary moratorium, hire legal counsel. Prior Matthias retreated from the ring and pressed his staff into the ground, breathing hard. He did not attempt to arrest Ilias. He did not attempt violence beyond the scuffle. Instead, he retreated to marshal what he could preserve. This was the fallout the outline required. Fracture, choices, and the beginning of institutional adaptation. Ilias left before dawn. He moved through the cloister with the torn stole tucked into his tunic. He paused at the ledger, placed his hand briefly on its cover, and left without speaking. Magdalena watched him go, and then set the ledger on the bench. She opened to a blank page, and with a small iron press began a new entry. A record of the night's events and a proposed schedule for a petition to secular authorities. Her handwriting was neat and efficient. The narrator recorded the signing in short, exact sentences. Names, times, motions. The external event of Elias's departure happened between paragraphs like a new bell. Prior Matthias convened an emergency assembly of the order's stewards and vowed to protect what he could by procedural means. He instructed his officers to catalogue immediate holdings and prepare for inspection. Yet, in private, he lifted the torn hem to his face and pressed it against his mouth. He inhaled the stale incense and felt a hollow where conviction had been. He would not abandon his duty to keep roofs, but he understood that preservation would no longer be identical to pretense. This was the completion of his arc. The man who preserved ritual forms now faced a choice about adaptation. Magdalena sealed the new ledger entry with the small iron and a fresh drop of wax. She wrote in the margin that she would present a petition to the local magistrate requesting reclassification of the named right as procedural obligation. She added that the petition would include witness statements and an account of historic continuity. Her hands moved with the calmness of someone who had catalogued contingency for 30 years. Her choice resolved her inner conflict between continuity and moral clarity. She would keep records, but she would reframe them to remove the pretense of worship. In the council's aftermath, men took sides openly. Some pledged to maintain forms with renewed strictness. Others accepted Magdalena's plan for legal conversion. A third, smaller faction followed Ilias into the countryside, where he intended to organize a group ready to live without the protection of the charter. The order fractured into 3 practical responses. Each choice had immediate consequences. Property at risk, cognitive dissonance resolved through paperwork, and a small, determined exodus. The narrator closed his notes with a precise recounting of the night's primary facts. The ledger clause, Elias's act of destruction, Magdalena's recorded petition, and Prior Matthias's retreat to procedural defense. He did not interpret motives beyond what actions displayed. He noted the change in the ledger's index. A new entry under Magdalena's hand that would become part of the archival chain. The external event of sealing the petition carried the same weight as the broken stone. By late morning the cloister smelled of dust and damp linen. The ring lay scarred. The stole's torn hem was folded into a small packet and placed in the ledger as evidence. Members moved like clerks at an archive, counting, signing, cataloguing. Ilias was already gone. He would either return with allies or not return at all. Prior Matthias convened a small conclave to consult legal advocates. Magdalena prepared the petition dossier and instructed the steward to deliver copies to magistrates. The order's future had shifted from a single ritual axis to administrative options. The final paragraph is itself a concrete beat. Magdalena closed the ledger and pressed the wax seal into place. She set the bound folio into its chest, turned the key in the lock, and laid the key on top of the closed lid. She did not speak. Outside, a messenger knocked at the chapter house door with news of an early market inspection scheduled by a nearby bailiff. The knock came twice. Magdalena set the chest into its place and walked to the door. She opened it and received the summons. The order's next steps would now be decided in open daylight and in courts where ink and signatures mattered more than song. The ledger was sealed. The ring remained broken on the stone. The narrator recorded the knock without commentary and closed his book. He noted the names of those who would travel to petition, the date written in ink, and the list of witnesses Magdalena had secured. He watched Magdalena lift the sealed folio beneath her arm and observed Prior Matthias standing by the stair, staff in hand, ready to go somewhere between preservation and concession. Elias's absence lingered like a gap in a roster. The concrete events had resolved the immediate conflict. The ring would not be the sole protector of holdings, and the order would survive by changing its forms. The ledger would now hold both the record of destruction and the record of legal conversion. Outside the chapter house, the first carts rolled toward the market. The order had both lost a worn circle of stone and gained a set of signed papers that might keep their fields intact for another season. Magdalena locked the archive chest and placed the key where it had always hung. She closed the door and heard the messenger's second knock dissolve into the morning's low traffic. She walked back to the ledger table and wrote a final line. Entry recorded, petition filed, witnesses listed. Then she sealed the page. The chapter closed on action. A sealed petition, a broken ring, and men moving already toward different futures.